I rise today in strong support of the Justice and Policing Act introduced yesterday by my colleagues, Senator Harris of California and Senator Booker from New Jersey. I am proud to be an original co-sponsor of this legislation. This legislation is urgently needed after the death of George Floyd in police custody in Minnesota, which has sent shockwaves through the nation and the world. I am pleased that the protests have been largely peaceful and that where in the Senate sits in Washington, our local leaders have moved to de-escalate tensions. I was pleased on Monday to hold a Facebook Live session with Hillary Shelton, the director of the NAACP's Washington Bureau and Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy, as well as Mark Morial, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Urban League and the former Mayor of New Orleans. We talked about this legislation in some detail. I received feedback from several of my constituents at my Facebook Live event on how to improve relations between police and communities they serve and how to rebuild trust between them. Before they first put on a badge, a police officer takes an oath to uphold the law. Most do so with the best intentions and carry out their duties with a willingness to help their communities. But in far too many communities around the country, the system in which they work has been failing. People are dying at the hands of police, predominantly people of color. Accountability has been tied to public videos rather than doing the right thing. Incremental reform is no longer an option when it comes to police reform. We've been patient, but we must do better to protect the civil rights, human rights, and lives of the men, women, and children in this country. Congress must finally pass a comprehensive plan to improve training and community relations, hold police accountable, and rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. To that end, I've been proud to work with my colleagues, Senator Booker and Senator Harris, on creating a package of reforms and accountability measures that shows that we need to be, as a nation, with a fair and just system of laws. The package focuses on three major pillars: accountability, data collection, and training policies. I was proud that two major pieces included in the Justice and Policing Act are from bills that I have introduced for many Congresses: the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act and the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act. The End Racial and Religious Profiling Act is designed to enforce the constitutional rights to equal protection under the law by eliminating racial and religious-based discriminatory profiling at all levels of law enforcement by changing the policies and procedures. It allows police to focus their work more accurately rather than wasting resources on blanket stereotypes. It requires enhanced data collection for DOJ to track and monitor discriminatory profiling. It holds state and local enforcement agencies accountable by conditioning federal funds on their adoption of policies and best practices to combat profiling by officers. The Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act takes a comprehensive approach on how local police organizations can adopt performance-based standards to ensure that instances of misconduct will be minimized through training and oversight. The bill provides that in such instances do occur, that they be properly investigated. It requires the creation of law enforcement accreditation standards and recommendations based on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. This bill also enhances funding for so-called pattern and practice discrimination cases. In Baltimore City, for example, the police department voluntarily entered into a consent decree in 2017 with the U.S. Department of Justice to overhaul the police department after the tragic death of Freddie Gray in police custody in 2015, which led to civil unrest in Baltimore. I might add, I am very pleased that we've seen progress in Baltimore, as evidenced by the types of protests after the Floyd tragedy. They have been almost all peaceful. In Baltimore, the Department of Justice report had found a widespread pattern and practice of illegal and unconstitutional conduct by the Baltimore Police Department through targeting African-American residents for disproportionate and disparate treatment. The U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland is now overseeing a complete overhaul of the Baltimore Police Department. We've made progress. Other important provisions of the Justice and Profiling Act will save lives. The bill bans chokeholds at the federal level and conditions law enforcement funding for state and local governments banning chokeholds. It bans no-knock warrants in drug cases at the federal level and conditions law enforcement funding for state and local governments banning no-knock warrants and it requires that deadly force be used only as a last resort and requires officers to employ de-escalation techniques first. It requires better data collection on how and in what circumstances police officers use force. We need these standards. We've seen too many tragedies when the misuse of power and force by law enforcement. The bill takes important steps to demilitarize our police forces. We are a civilian society. We're not run as a military state. It encourages more professionalism, consistent with changing our police officers' mentality from a warrior mindset to a guardian mindset. The legislation limits the transfer of military-grade equipment to state and local law enforcement. It requires federal uniformed police officers to wear body cameras and requires state and local law enforcement to use existing federal funds to ensure the use of police body cameras. This comprehensive legislation takes several important steps to hold police accountable in courts. It makes it consistent with standard practice to prosecute offending officers and enables individuals to recover damages in civil courts when law enforcement officers violate their constitutional rights by changing qualified immunity for law enforcement. Finally, legislation gives better tools to the Department of Justice and state attorney generals to investigate and prosecute police misconduct. It reinvests in our communities by supporting critical community-based programs to change the culture of law enforcement and empower our communities to reimagine public safety in an equitable and just way. As I mentioned earlier, in Baltimore, after the Freddie Gray tragedy, we recognized that we needed to do a better job in working with communities and police, and we reached out. And part of our consent judgment order decree is to improve that relationship, that direct relationship between police and community. The legislation that I've mentioned on the floor here establishes public safety innovation grants for community-based organizations to create local commissions and task force to help communities to reimagine and develop concrete, just, and equitable public safety approaches. Let me share with you two stories. And I do that because there are so many people that have come forward, shared their experiences growing up and living in a society of discrimination. I remember very vividly after the Freddie Gray episode in Baltimore, I met with a group of community leaders in Sandtown where the tragedy occurred and listened to their accounts of how they grew up with the fear of police and the stories of how they were singled out or discriminated by traffic stops, by other harassment just because of the color of their skin. So let me share with you two stories that were reported recently in the paper. One is the story of Michael Turner, his encounter years ago with the Montgomery County Police. Turner was only 18 years of age when this encounter occurred. Officers had come to break up a party in a suburban county and quickly focused on Turner and his fellow African-American friends. They checked IDs. No one was drunk. The cops asked them to move along. One officer looked at us, as Turner recounted, and says, "Now go back to your projects." The broader context of the email written 8 days ago was Turner's effort to explain why he wanted a protest in downtown Silver Spring. "We come in peace, Commander," he wrote. "March with us. It's time for a change. I'm ready to help. Are you?" The email set off 6 days of written and phone dialogue between Turner and Captain Darren Franke, who commands the Silver Spring Police District for the Montgomery County Department. It culminated Sunday afternoon when Turner, Franke, and 3 other Montgomery County police officers took a knee in front of more than 200 protesters facing them and stretching half a block down Georgia Avenue. Everyone sat still for 2 minutes and 53 seconds, the estimated time George Floyd lay unconscious with his neck pinned below the knee of a Minneapolis police officer. Turner's protests in the sprawling suburb just miles north of the district had a different twist. It was a demonstration put together with the active help of police. To Captain Frankie, it all made sense. He had served in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard and joined the Montgomery Police in 1996. A father of three, including a daughter, who also came to the protest, he previously commanded the department's Major Crimes Division, supervising murder investigations throughout the county. Frankie wrote, "Thank you for sharing your story. I don't blame you for having a chip on your shoulders. I am not proud of some of the things that a few officers did before and now. I am saddened and angered by what happened to George Floyd and a number of others over many years that were clearly violations of the values that the vast majority of officers have. My officers and I will march with you," Frankie added. "With your assistance, we will also help to keep the event safe from those that would want to turn your message into something else. We want your message to be heard." By 1 p.m. Sunday, more than 200 people had gathered at Veterans Plaza in downtown Silver Spring. They marched 3 blocks to the corner of Colesville Road and Georgia Avenue, halted, and waited for Turner to lead everyone to one knee. He swayed back and forth, his head buried in a towel, weeping as he thought of Floyd's family. Frankie stood next to him, clapping. Next, a quick prayer, then the kneel. The crowd erupted with applause at the 2 minutes and 53-second mark as the group marched back to Veterans Plaza. A series of speakers addressed the crowd. At about 3:30, Turner handed the microphone back to the commander, Mr. Frankie. The commander told the crowd about Turner's encounter with the police at the age of 18 years. Then the captain turned to him and said, "I'm sorry." That story, I think, underscores the importance of what happened in Minneapolis affects everybody in our country, not just the African American community. So let me close with one additional story that was also reported and brings out a very familiar challenge for African American families. As the day drew to a close, Deshaun Raspberry, age 6, and his younger brother, Davian, age 4, were already tired. They had been at Pennsylvania Avenue and 13th Street since noon with their mother, Janessa Smith, age 28, handing out water, Gatorade, granola bars as people were passing. The brothers had never seen so many people before, and neither had Mrs. Smith. It was the family's first protest. "Do you know why all these people are here?" the mother asked her younger son. He stared at the crowd, munching on his granola bar that had crumbled to pieces in his hands. His child replied, "They're out here for you." The mother replied, "They're out here for you." Davian was dressed in a Superman cap and a matching T-shirt and smiled and nodded. Mrs. Smith had explained to her sons that they were here to protest, which means standing up for something, she said, and to help others. She hadn't told them that the protest was against police brutality, spurred by the killing of a man with their same skin color in police custody. "They're so young now, still so young," Mrs. Smith said, "and right now they're in love with law enforcement. I don't want to spoil it, not yet." And she pointed out that neither of her children were afraid of police. Mrs. Smith looked at her sons, both just barely coming up to her waist, gripping cold water bottles. One day, she'll have to give them the talk about police officers, she thought to herself, but not today. Let's rise to the occasion so that Janessa Smith never has to give that heartbreaking talk to her boys in Prince George's County, Maryland. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to focus on our common humanity and respect for the rule of law. There are examples of best practices in community policing that should be a guide nationwide. Let us work together to guarantee equal justice under the law and fulfill the promise of our Constitution in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, and ensure domestic tranquility. Let this nation finally guarantee equal justice under the law, which is carved in the marble of the entrance to the Supreme Court, which is just across the street from our Senate chamber. Madam President, I yield the floor.